Hello and welcome to my video all about how to change to a new ball of knitting yarn when the first one runs out. So say you're knitting along and suddenly you're nearly out of yarn. Well, I'm going to show you two different ways of adding a new ball of yarn so you can carry on knitting. The first method I'm going to show you is called a Russian join, which is my favourite technique in most situations. The downsides of a Russian join are that it's slightly more effort and takes a bit more time than the most common method, which is the one I'm going to show you later in the video. And it's also quite difficult to accurately place the join exactly where you want to in the knitting. So because of that, I wouldn't use the Russian join to change from one colour of yarn to another. I would only use it to join balls of yarn of the same colour. Please note that I'm using two different colours of yarn today to demonstrate the Russian join, but that's purely for demonstration purposes to make it more clear. The reasons I like the Russian join are that it's neat and quite smooth, and also you don't have to weave in the yarn tail ends at the end of your project. To do a Russian join you need a yarn needle. Here I've got some yarn darning needles, but any needle with an eye big enough for the yarn to go through will work. I'm just using a scrap piece of strong cotton thread to help me thread the yarn onto the needle. I simply fold the thread in half and feed the folded end through the needle. I then feed one yarn end through that loop and then pull on the ends of the thread. This can take a bit of brute force, but it pulls the yarn through the eye of the needle like so. If you have a needle threader, you could use that instead. It doesn't matter which yarn ends you use for this. You can use the one that's connected to your knitting already, or you can use the end from the new ball of yarn. I'm using a chunky needle out of a set of circular needles to help me with the next step. You can use a pen or pencil or your finger instead. You'll probably have noticed that knitting yarn is created from different strands being twisted together. These strands are called plies. What we're going to be doing with the yarn needle is feeding it up through the centre of the piece of yarn. You might need to loosen or untwist the plies slightly in your yarn, especially if you're using a lightweight yarn. So I'm placing the chunky knitting needle a few inches from the end of the piece of yarn. I then take the yarn needle and feed it into the yarn like so. You want to feed that yarn needle up the centre of the piece of yarn, moving away from where I have the chunky knitting needle. You'll be scrunching up the yarn as you go. And then after a few inches you feed the yarn needle out of the yarn. You can then take the yarn needle off the yarn. The chunky knitting needle is purely to keep the loop of yarn around it intact throughout this process. The next stage is to stretch out and smooth out the plies in the yarn. So at the moment they're all scrunched up, but we want those to be stretched out. So you just keep pulling the yarn and smoothing it with your fingers until you get a neat finish like this. And then we do pretty much exactly the same with the other yarn end. So we take the end of the other piece of yarn now and thread it through the needle. So you feed a few inches of this yarn through the loop that you just made. And then you're going to take the yarn back on itself, and again you're going to feed it through the centre of the yarn. As before, you want to feed the yarn a few inches through the centre before feeding the yarn needle out of that piece of yarn. You then remove the yarn needle, and once again you want to pull the yarn and smooth the plies out with your fingers. Once you're happy that the join is neat and smooth, you can take your scissors and cut off the excess of the yarn tails. You want to cut off as much of the yarn ends as possible because you want the join to be a very smooth transition and you don't want any bits of yarn sticking out. And then you can test out the join to make sure that it's very secure. And that's one of the big advantages of the Russian join. It's a very strong and secure join. And now I'm going to show you the most common and popular way to change from one ball of yarn to the other. If you're not changing yarn colour, you can do this technique at any point in a row. You don't have to go to the end of a row or the start of a row. If you are planning to do a colour change, then to do this technique you would first finish a row, because you would need to do this technique on the first stitch of a new row. Cut the yarn to leave you with a yarn tail at least 8 inches long, preferably more like 12 inches. You then take the end of the new ball of yarn and you lay it in a hook shape. You want to lay it out like I have here, so that the yarn tail is away from you and measures at least 8 inches long. In the example I'm demonstrating today, I'm doing a garter stitch scarf with slip stitch edges. You can't change to a new ball of yarn on a slip stitch, because a slip stitch doesn't incorporate the working yarn at all. You're simply transferring the stitch from one needle to the other. Therefore, because I'm doing slip stitch edges and my first stitch is a slip stitch, I'm going to do that now with the current yarn and not the new yarn. All of the rest of the stitches in this row are knit stitches, which of course make use of the working yarn, so I could choose to add the new ball of yarn in on any of these stitches. So you simply wait for an opportunity to add the new ball of yarn in, i.e. a stitch that's not a slip stitch, and then you do the following. You begin the stitch, so in my case I'm beginning a knit stitch by taking the right hand needle up through the top stitch on the left hand needle. At this point, where I would normally take the working yarn of the current yarn and wrap it around the right hand needle point, instead I'm going to pick up the loop of yarn that I've created with the new ball of yarn and I'm going to hook that over the right hand needle point, making sure that the yarn tail side is towards the back and the working yarn side is towards me. I'm going to hold that loop in place with my right hand against the right hand needle, and then I'm going to complete a normal knit stitch. And all you do now is just carry on knitting as normal. The only thing to watch out for is that the first few stitches will be a bit loose, so make sure you tighten up the tension as you go along. Once you've knitted a few rows in the new yarn, you can go back and weave in the yarn tails, or you can leave all the yarn tails to be woven in after you've finished your knitting project. And that's it. Those are the two best ways, in my opinion, to change the ball of yarn. I hope that's been helpful to you, and thank you very much for watching.